All right, let's talk about just the rising mob justice culture we're seeing. And yes, it's happening in KZN predominantly, but certainly is happening in other parts of the country as well. Criminologist Professor Nirmala Gopal joins us for more on this story. Professor Gopal, thank you so much for the time this evening. Appreciate it. They say the wheels of justice turn slowly, but they do turn. It's that turning slowly that creates mob justice, isn't it?
Well, good evening, Arabella, and good evening to your viewers. I think there's multiple reasons. Of course, one of the reasons is that the wheels of justice turn very slowly, and perhaps that's what causes frustration amongst those who are looking for very immediate retribution, for example. So yeah, that could be one of the reasons, but of course we know that the reasons are varied, and mob justice, besides the fact that it is it's illegal in all of its senses, I think is just extremely cruel. And it subjects people to extreme physical abuse, torture, and even death. So in all, at all levels, it's something to be absolutely condemned.
So let's talk about the other reasons you made note of there with regards to why people would be so willing to partake in mob justice. Let's unpack some of those, if you will, please.
So I think one of them, one of the most notable reasons is the fact that there's anonymity in a crowd. So people believe that the likelihood of them being apprehended is very unlikely. So they believe that they will still be protected. So that's one of the reasons. Besides the fact that they have very little confidence in law enforcement. So I think for me, those are the two major reasons why they would actually engage in mob justice.
Yeah, it's one of those as well that when people look at doing something like this, they think to themselves, well, if the police are not going to do the job, then we might as well do it ourselves. And then the police go on and say, well, we're actually not going to then engage with you. And it becomes this vicious circle. How do we get it right?
So I think one of the most important ways, and somebody mentioned that earlier, is to educate the public. And I think the fact that our public is just so uneducated in terms of why we should not be engaging in mob justice is one of the most pervasive reasons for why we have mob justice occurring in a South African society, for example. So for me, one is education. The second one is the fact that violence has become so normalized. So when individuals in a society engage in violence, they believe it's a normal part of resolving conflict, for example. And I think, also educating our community in terms of understanding that violence should actually be condemned in the most strongest of terms, and the fact that it is a pathology and it should not be accepted in our society. So using violence to resolve violence is something that is a concept that many in our society have become so used to that we don't realize that it is actually against the law to engage in violence.
I was actually about to touch on just that very point as well then, because people could actually get imprisoned or charged with criminal activity if they continue to partake in mob attacks, right?
Absolutely, and of course, depending on the severity of the crime, it could lead. Oftentimes, it leads to issues or cases of death, and in that case, we would have culpable homicide. And obviously, then the legislation place, and they would have to be tried in a court of law and sanctioned and sentenced accordingly. So obviously there have to be penalties and legal penalties per se.
What does the police, or what's the role of the police then in all of this? Because while there's a clear understanding that the mob attacks are incorrect, they shouldn't be happening, they're lawless in that way. The other aspect of this is that there is a clear frustration in maybe the slowness in police reaction, the slowness in apprehension of perpetrators. Unfortunately, mob attacks could also be to the wrong person. But how does that communication happen better? Is it a case of the police just being better, or a case of, just as you made note of, education?
So I think it's multifaceted. On the one hand, we have community. One of the mandates of the Community Policing Forum is to educate the community, and I think it's not being used as effectively as it should be. So that would be, one of the most effective ways in which to educate our communities. But I think, of course, the second issue is the fact that confidence in our police system is at an absolute low in South Africa. And because the confidence level is so low, then of course citizens believe that they are able to attain justice quicker and more effectively. And of course, then that undermines both our democracy, but also one of our most important institutions in the country, which is policing specifically, but safety and security more generically.
Yeah, it's going to be a concern, and the worry is that if it continues, of course, it could spread across the country then as well. Is there a harder message that needs to be sent out, particularly by National Commissioner of Police, the Police Minister, maybe even the President?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen multiple incidences across the country over a number of years. And I think the message is that it will not be tolerated, because violence cannot beget violence. You cannot achieve justice through violence. And I think that the sentencing has to be harsher. We need the judiciary to come in, to exert their might as well in terms of showing the perpetrators that this will not be tolerated. And how do we do that effectively? And I think one of the ways in which we would do that is to ensure that the sanctions, the sentencing is far harsher than what we currently impose.
And if that is the case, then you'd ultimately need to change laws, right? I mean, that just seems like also a process in itself, which could take longer. Am I correct?
No, you don't necessarily have to change the laws. What you do is look at the severity of the crime, and your punishment should fit the crime. So it has nothing to do with changing of laws at this point in time. It just means imposing harsher sentences.
So what does that say then about our judicial system right now? Does that mean we're perhaps just too lenient, or is it now a case of saying, well, actually, we just need to now be even harsher than we were before?
Yeah, of course, there's multiple factors to consider when imposing a sanction. But I think, Arabella, one of the more difficult issues is the fact that when these cases go to court, oftentimes you find that the South African Police Service has not done their work effectively, so you'd find gaps in terms of the reports, etc., especially procedural gaps that allow the perpetrators then to get off either with a lighter sentence or to get off completely.
Yeah, and that's ultimately the one thing you then don't want to have, because the moment you have those elements, it's exactly what creates the ire, the anger, that, of course, is happening a whole lot more. KZN has an escalating crime rate as well. That is what is also keenly in focus, and that is why we're seeing it happen so much more there. Professor, thank you so much for the time this evening. Really appreciate it. Professor Nirmala Gopal joining us there as we try to get a sense of the mob attacks that actually happen across this country, particularly in KwaZulu-Natal, where we're seeing that rise, of course, in criminality as well as violence.